Hi, it's Ron Turpin. I am the host of the new podcast called PODigal Sons. I wanted to do an introduction video and basically kind of set up the podcast and talk about what we're going to be talking about. So I'm naming it the PODigal Sons. I myself am a prodigal son, and I think this is going to be interesting. I think there's going to be sort of a new perspective from somebody that's sort of coming back into the faith after a while. And I think at some point, kind of we all go through that. I'm doing it by myself to start, not really by choice, but I do think it's appropriate in that you kind of start your prodigal son journey by yourself. Kind of find it within yourself. So we're going to be covering a wide range of topics, but the main thing we're going to be doing is a Bible companion in which we will basically be going chapter by chapter, verse by verse, through the entire Bible, from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. I think it's going to help a lot of people to sort of bring clarity to the Bible. I've done some Bible study in the past, but I just really enjoy sort of summarizing the Bible or sort of bringing clarity to things where it might be sort of difficult. I know for me, starting, when I first read the Bible, I would probably get somewhere into Leviticus and kind of throw my hands in the air and not really understand the context of what it's saying. So that's what we're going to be doing in a podcast format. We're going to be using two different types of Bibles. The New American Bible, which is just my old Bible that I grew up with. We're going to be referencing the ESV. This is not a denomination-specific podcast. I really wanted to do this to have everyone involved, Orthodox, Protestants, Catholics, everybody that is a Christian. This wouldn't really be for your fringe Christian denominations like Mormonism. I would still invite you to sort of, learn. But for the main part, we're mostly talking about Christianity aligned with Catholicism, Orthodox, and Protestants. I will say we'll probably do a podcast sort of just covering the differences. I myself grew up Catholic but have really enjoyed, different Protestant churches and don't really have an issue with where you're at. So where we're going to start in this sort of before we get into Genesis 1, I wanted to do sort of a brief overview of creationism. I think a lot of people come to the faith sort of in their questioning. I think, as a kid in the 90s, I think we sort of came through all of our different science classes, and then eventually in college, and creationism was sort of mocked in a way, not really taken seriously. And I think a lot of people's questioning about their faith actually kind of comes from this modern day view of creationism. And I wanted to talk about, creationism versus atheism. So we'll begin with sort of the origin of the universe and the origin of the earth. These are one of the more highly discussed things that you'll hear talked about between creationism and atheism. I'm not going to be going into a super in-depth conversation on these. I'm not a scientist. I'm just going to give you my brief overview and how I came to these conclusions. I think it would help you just kind of maybe hearing my reasoning for it. But again, you can do your research. People spend their whole lives researching this stuff, never really quite finding an answer. So for me, that's what I'll kind of be summarizing in a way. We'll start with the Big Bang and kind of go through, atheism. You're going to have most of your origin of life and the universe is going to be founded in science. And with creationists, you're usually referencing, the God, your God itself, which for the Judeo-Christian God is going to be Genesis. But we'll start with the Big Bang. For me, I kind of have always looked at this as two different versions. You have basically a singularity in which all the mass and all the energy was at one singularity at one point, and then some type of reaction happened, and then it started expanding, and then now we have the universe that we know it. Or you might, and there's other theories where there was nothing in the beginning, and then something happened. Now I would say, like, if to go from nothing to everything, it actually takes a lot more faith to believe that. So that's always a difficult thing to wrap your head around, and you start doing these mental gymnastics about how the universe started. It's very complicated, and it's not something really probably most people will ever really understand. But we'll talk a little bit about it. So the Big Bang, complicated, but really it boils down to there being some type of singularity and it expanding. One thing that has came out more recently, and there's been more research into this, that has sort of changed how the origin of the universe and the expansion of the universe is looked at, is dark energy. Dark energy is this mysterious force that scientists really don't even understand, that is expanding the universe. In a way, you can think about the universe is creating itself. So for me, I think about the universe creating itself, and that is just an obvious indicator of a creator. There's really no reason for it to create itself, and atheism sort of exists outside of reason, but when you view it from the lens of a creationist, it makes a lot more sense, and how and why the universe is doing that. With atheism, you don't really need a why, it's just that is the result, but it does beg the question, why is the universe creating itself? But in the end, when you kind of summarize dark energy, it is sort of this mysterious thing that is, and it's expanding in different rates, and it's not something that people quite can understand. The Big Bang kind of had this consistency that people thought of, and then we look at dark energy, and that sort of changes that consistency. Again, not a scientist. I'm not going to go so far down the rabbit hole in each one of these subjects. I'm just going to sort of summarize each one, and then kind of go through it. Now, probably the most common reason I think atheism or atheists exist is probably because they don't really see a creator or evidence of a creator. And that is a pretty, I would say, kind of a valid thing that they would point to as to why they might be an atheist. Now, for a Christian, I would just look at the remnants of what we have in Christ, the Holy Spirit, living through us, performing miracles. And for me, that's enough of what I would point at as evidence of a creator. It would be nice if we had some sort of being or something that identified themselves as God and performed signs and miracles so that we know for sure that there is a creator. And really, we had that, right? So we don't really need anything outside of Christ to point at and say, where is the creator? That is the creator. And we have more than enough evidence to go through his existence and his life, and we'll touch on that. But I do want to point out that where is the creator is sort of probably a reason why most people are atheists. If they did have this kind of in their face proof that there was a creator, I think it'd be very hard to be an atheist at that point, obviously. But I think they're ignoring the remnants, all the different signs and all these different things that have happened over the past 2,000 years. The Bible sort of starts off with the most amount of involvement from God, and then it slowly starts becoming more and more about humanity and God living in us, and that is what happens with the Holy Spirit at the end of the Gospels. So for me, that's a big one. I think atheists will kind of point at, but I would kind of point right back at them with the many remnants that we have. Another big question that you're going to struggle with if you are an atheist is, where does life begin? Or how does life come from non-life? How do we have humans, which would have, theoretically came from rocks, essentially? And if you sort of go down that road, there used to be this theory that there was primordial sludge and lightning strikes and heat, and then eventually something reproduced itself. But they never proved that, and it was actually disproven. And there's a big question mark on where does life come from. You would actually think it wouldn't be that hard to sort of, hey, we combine this chemical with this chemical and we get this cell. But the more and more they research into the complexity of how these cells work and how tissue is made up, it's so much harder to come up with some sort of origin of life. And there's never really been an answer to that. So for me, that's already three things right there that are big ones as far as why atheism is a hard thing for me to track or to follow. The next one we'll talk about is the fine-tuning of the universe. This is one of the most important, I would say, creationist points. When you think about, so basically just to sum up the fine-tuning of the universe, let's say, basically what the theory is, or what the explanation is if the speed of light was just different by a small fraction, or if the gravitational pull was just ever so slightly different, or whatever law of physics that you take, and if it was slightly different, we would have chaos on a molecular level. Planets wouldn't be able to position themselves around stars. And the more and more that you look into that, the more and more for me that it points to a creator. There's a funny clip of young Sheldon in which his mom is sort of in this weird questionable phase of her faith, and Sheldon, being an atheist, actually brings her mom back to faith, sort of using that argument, and is a very good argument. And I would say something that I would look into if you're still questioning your faith, because the more and more that you read about it, I think the more and more you'd be solidified in creationism. The next one is Fermi's paradox and the Drake equation. Again, I'm not going to go into that and give you specifics, but to summarize it, you look around the universe and you have all these trillions of planets and all these trillions of stars or billions of stars, and you would think that there would be other signs of life. You would think there would be higher life forms that were able to at least send out radio frequencies or would want to come and take our resources. Is more of a theoretical type of science, but you do start to question, why are we seemingly alone when we really shouldn't be, considering how many stars and planets there are. I do like that. I like pointing that out because, again, it's just another unanswerable thing that atheists are sort of forced to deal with. We could probably do a podcast on each one of these, and eventually we might do that. But I'm just going to kind of keep it short and simple and sort of give you the summarized version of these things. Another one that we'll talk about, which is a newer one, is simulation theory. You have really, really smart guys like Elon Musk who come out and they say, hey, there's like a 1 in a billion chance that we're not living in a simulation, and we're most likely living in a simulation. And they look at sort of the progression of humanity and our virtual worlds that we have created, from the beginning of Pong, which was just dots on a screen, to now we have these high-tech sort of over the past 40 years, we have these really high-tech virtual worlds and stuff. And it's not really evidence of or I would say it's not really a theory that sort of supports Christianity, nor necessarily. But when you think about living in a simulation or being a part of a simulation, in a way, I think it's, if you looked at the Bible, and is this life a test by God to see who is worthy to live with them? At that point, simulation theory and the Bible sort of start marrying themselves together a little bit, because maybe this is what this whole, this is why we're here, is to see, who who is really able and worthy in answering the call to be around God. It's sort of like, if you think about, and we'll go back to, or we'll talk a little bit about evolution as well, but in Fermi's paradox, not having any visible higher life forms. Atheists are kind of, in a way, a little bit arrogant to say that we are the highest life form that is observed. They kind of are forced to say that because there are no proof of any other higher life form. So in a way, you're sort of arrogantly saying there is nothing higher than us. We can control whatever we want on this planet. If we wanted to nuke it to smithereens, we can. And to say that, for me, is just a little bit arrogant. So how does that relate to simulation theory, or how are the two combined? Well, and how does that relate to what God is maybe setting up for us? So in the same way that, a dog owner might qualify dogs before they live in the presence of them, this could very well kind of be along that same line, in which God is the next higher life form, and we're not going to get a chance to really be around him unless we listen to him and have faith in him, and listen or follow all of his commandments, right? So for me, simulation theory is actually really cool when you start thinking about it. Just to kind of reference the Bible real quick, just to kind of how I would say that fits in. If you go look at Matthew chapter 13, as the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out his kingdom, everything that causes sin and all who do evil. So, tough way to start this podcast. But I will say that simulation theory is very interesting. And it's something that's taken more and more seriously over the years, especially when you have somebody like Elon Musk, very smart individual who sort of believes wholeheartedly in it. Anyways, another thing that you're going to find difficult with atheism is there's really no purpose of life at all. And you have, I think it was Hawkins who said it, maybe Hitchens, but sort of just like admitting, that might be the reality of it, is there is no purpose of life. That's just for me, that's sort of a weird thing to say, and I just don't see how that could be the case. When you think about evolution, and I want to get into that because we're going to talk about morals and sort of where morals come from. We'll probably go back to that, but evolution is really the strongest survive, right? So there is no reason for a moral code to exist. You'll have atheists that talk about, social contracts have existed since the beginning of time, and monkey scratching one monkey's back and the other monkey's going to scratch the other person. Well, that doesn't make any sense. I'm sorry, it doesn't, because the ultimate social contract is, do what I say or I will kill you. And we see this practice all the time and throughout history. The biggest example of this would be the Nazis, right? If the Nazis took over the world successfully, there wouldn't be any morals that have to exist. We would have to do what they say or they kill us. And this is what used to sort of control the ancient world. And that's why Jesus is so important, because Jesus comes in and basically destroys that entire mentality by taking up the cross and by saying, you can do whatever you want to my earthly body, but ultimately it doesn't have any effect on my soul. This was a huge turning point in how people kind of viewed this power structure. So the whole social contract argument as far as morals go, I mean, if you're an atheist, there's nothing that says that morals have to exist. I'm sorry, but it's just not really possible, or it doesn't make any sense that they would have to, considering, this strongest survive. And we see that in the natural world, right? Like a lion is going to do infanticide and all these weird things, because there's nothing that says that they can't. Unless we take like a dog and we put it in captivity and then we try to train it and teach it and how to, do things properly. And so it's an interesting thing that, not going to go so far down that rabbit hole as well. Evolution, macro evolution's not really something that has any proof to it. The more and more that they look into that, the harder it is for them to really solidify evolution as how we came into being. Again, microevolution, sure, we can all accept that, and that just might be more of an explanation of the laws of nature that God has implemented, or how we sort of are able to reproduce. But I don't think evolution. I think evolution does definitely have its flaws, especially when you talk about the moral code, or really probably the absence of what any moral code would be. You have other theories that are sort of coming up. CTMU is a theory by this guy Christopher Langan, who is a really smart guy. He has like the highest IQ. It's like 200 IQ, cognitive theoretical model of the universe. You can go look into that. That's a new one. That's an interesting one. It does point to God, and you sort of have to be a very highly intelligent person to read about these things. But I would say go give it a whack. And 1 second. Sorry about that, guys. I got a phone call. But kind of picking up where I left off, there are some very cool, interesting theories that are newer. I would go check that out. It's an interesting one. Christopher Langan, CTMU. Well, next we'll talk about DNA. There's been a lot more research into DNA. I'm not a scientist, but if you go look at DNA and how complex it is, and how we have this sort of code of genetics that is honestly so in-depthly designed, really, that you look at that, it's hard not to see that there's a creator. So you talk about like the micro level of things versus looking into space and the macro level of things. And for me, there's just way too much that points to a creator, and we really haven't even gotten into the evidence of Christ yet. So we're just kind of at the beginning stages, and already it just makes a lot more sense for me to start off with creationism. And starting off with creationism it's a big thing as far as how you're going to approach the rest of everything. Because if you sort of buy into creationism, or let's say the moment that you sort of dip your foot into creationism, everything at that point is a possibility. I mean, the law of physics do not apply to the creator. Time doesn't work the same way for a creator necessarily. He can completely control time. Law of gravity, or whatever other law that you have that you would normally be tied down to, it's not going to matter, because you are literally the creator of the universe. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. So we'll start off, once you accept creationism, then we sort of have these other arguments like young Earth versus new Earth. There's a lot of science that is done into how old is the Earth, how old is the universe, how old is the sun, how old is XYZ. For me, I'm not really somebody that needs to have this explained. Now, I actually would side on the scientist side, because I feel like at some point, I actually really appreciate what science is doing, because what they are doing is they have a passion for wanting to figure out the truth of things. And there's no problem with that. I think we sort of look at scientists like they're doing something wrong, and they're really not. I mean, they should be appreciated for the pursuit of truth. Lying is a sin. I mean, if I was a scientist and I had put all this work into how old is the Earth, and I went into the Grand Canyon, and I did all these different carbon dating research, and I was able to predict these things, and somebody came in and say, well, you're telling a lie, hey, are you calling me a liar? And I think that's what kind of scientists are coming at this from that angle. And when you read the Bible and you had this sort of preconceived notion that we need to know how old the earth is, and you find out it doesn't actually even say. It says, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, the entire heavens and the earth. It doesn't mention at all how old the earth is. Now there's other things that we'll go through. When we start with Genesis, we will go through, day 1, day 2, day 3, and we'll do a full analysis of Genesis. But I want you to keep in mind that it doesn't really necessarily even give us, it doesn't at all give us how old is the earth. So why is that even brought up? I don't know. The earth could very well be 4 billion years old. We don't really have any reason to think otherwise or have the need to think otherwise. So it's an interesting thing. I think, we sort of have this was all, done kind of recently. A lot of these different approaches have all sort of surfaced out of the scientific movement. A lot of people sort of worship science, and that's sort of the new Tower of Babel in our day. And I think there's a lot of good things that science can do, but I think ultimately, it's not really going to have any implication on what God does. God doesn't owe science an explanation for anything at all. It doesn't owe science an explanation for how a staff turns into a snake, or how people are raised from the dead, or how the Nile can turn into blood. And so it doesn't owe science an explanation. God doesn't owe science an explanation for anything. We'll talk about sort of how that might have worked. If God wanted to do whatever he wanted to do and speed up time, and time doesn't really get installed when you think about like time as sort of, we know it as one revolution. That doesn't happen until the fourth day. So for me, there's sort of I'm not so sure that time worked at the same in those first 7 days as it does for us, the way we think about it. One revolution, 24 hours. It could have, and that's another theory, and we'll kind of go through that here momentarily. Here's the thing, another thing about science, though. I don't like using science when it supports my worldview, or I don't like using science when it supports Christianity and then totally disregarding it when it doesn't. I think that's a lot of mistake that apologetics or people in apologetics will make. For me, I'll sort of take everything with a grain of salt. If there's some sort of evidence that says that this didn't happen or something, I'll kind of, not really going to let that persuade me, because remember, we're already a creationist. So anything's possible. Why that I have to, have example of this would be Bill Nye pointing at Noah's Ark and saying, kangaroos can't reach Australia in the time given because 4,000 years. Bill Nye, I mean, we're talking about the creator of the universe. If he wanted to float the kangaroos over there, he could. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back and forth with scientists on a lot of things. I think it's interesting the more and more they do research about, hey, this dinosaur was found with soft tissue, and soft tissue couldn't possibly survive. Or you have these creationists that sort of spend their time and so much energy trying to justify that the earth is only 4,000 years old, or whatever other thing it is. And for me, it doesn't matter. I don't really need it. So again, we're not going to use science to benefit us when we want to, but then disregard it when it doesn't. I do think that that's wrong. So we'll talk about sort of, I think there's 3 different ways you can sort of interpret how God creates the world, or really the universe, and then the world and how we know it. You could sort of go with the ultra literal explanation, and it is 24-hour days. Nothing wrong with that if you want to do that. I think you're going to probably be faced with more questions than not. But I wouldn't judge you, or I wouldn't say that you're wrong by believing that. I would just think, hey, there's probably something missing though, because we do find these dinosaurs, and there is things that we sort of have to answer to. The next one is literal with missing information, not necessarily missing information, but let's say like a misunderstanding or requiring a further understanding. That's probably where I would more fall in line with. I think God very well could have created the earth in 7 days, or created the world as we know it in 7 days, or the sun in 7 days. If God wanted to have the earth in one part of the heavens and then just bring it to us, he could. It could have been part of the billions of years creation. I think people don't think outside the box enough when they approach that, and they need to, because ultimately God can do anything, and doing things outside of the box is definitely within the realm of possibility. You can't sort of put a box around God and say, well, the law of nature or the law of physics says this, and so you can't have done that. It doesn't work that way. As far as like how, let's say, dinosaurs might have existed or why they might have existed, several different reasons. They could have served a purpose for, fuel that we would need. They could have been just something cool that God created. There's not really one reason. It could have been a test of faith. He could have put them there and be like, hey, these people are going to dig these up, and then let's see if they really believe in me. I don't really know or need to go figure out an explanation for the dinosaurs. You will have a lot of these like young Earth scientists that will point to, like, can you have pre-sin death? And there's sort of an issue with that. Like, hey, we didn't, Adam and Eve haven't sinned yet. There was no death before that. So dinosaurs couldn't have existed before Adam and Eve. I don't see how that they get to that conclusion, to be honest with you. It doesn't really specify or give any specifics on that. For me, there's the Garden of Eden, and there's sort of everything else. There's also humanity, which was made in God's image, in his divine image, and then you have everything else. I mean, they were eating plants. I would imagine that plants decayed, and bugs or whatever else, thing. Were they only vegetarians in the beginning? Like, I think that starts to open up a can of worms that I don't really find the need to go down that road as well. But I will say, if you sort of have this metaphorical view about the opening of the Bible, like even some people will view this through Noah's Ark, I will say I don't agree with that. I'm not going to just, the Word of God is the Word of God. He's not going to lie to us. So I would take everything 100% literally before I would start doing this metaphorical dance, so that my Christianity also aligns with science. I'm not going to take that stance. I hope this is helping you guys. I'm just really wanting to go through sort of the reasoning behind this, so that I can get you guys bought into creationism, so that you can see that anything is possible. I will say, moving on to science in general, Christianity sort of is in a way responsible for a lot of science. I know that sounds crazy, but when you think about universities and how they were first founded in the pursuit of truth, I mean, all of them almost were Christian. Now you do have like Islamic universities, and sure, we can go into that, but there's still a sort of a higher purpose before they just did science. Almost no society, Egyptians or whoever else it was, had science without religion. They sort of go hand in hand. So for me, if you look at the early Christians, or not the early Christians, but I would say like around 1000 AD, really universities and the pursuit of truth is sort of a Christian principle. So we sort of have to take credit for science to begin with, and now it's sort of evolved into this other thing. But it is interesting. Guys, you can go do all the research you want into this, I would say you can go watch the Lennox-Dawkins debate. It's a really good one. If you're following apologetics or want to go look into that, I mean, that's a rabbit hole. I myself was in that rabbit hole for a long time. You might need to go do that. It just might be an itch you need to scratch, but John Lennox is one of my favorite. Frank Turek. You have William Lane Craig. Ken Ham's a good one. And on the atheist side, you'll have like Dawkins and Hitchens, and there's really not too many, honestly. Like I would say, like atheists. I think maybe Matt Dillahunty. I don't know. But those are good debates worth watching, and you'll sort of get everyone's view on it. But yeah, I think that's sort of the brief overview on that we touched on atheism versus creationism, sort of how I came to that. It's not going to be any one thing that I look at as 100% proof, but it's sort of how the whole story kind of fits in. So for me, the dark energy, the life coming from non-life, the all these different things, morals existing. These are all things for me that have helped solidified creationism. So we'll sort of start into, before we pick a creator, because we still haven't done that, we'll talk about another big issue that I would say atheists have. And you'll hear even guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about this. I think it goes as far back as Plato, maybe. But why does God allow evil? That's a big one. That's a big one for Christians. Why does God allow evil if he's so powerful and so awesome? Why are we living with this evil thing? And it's a valid question, right? I would say it's probably the most valid outside of where is the creator? Why does God allow evil? But things didn't change for me until I started thinking about it from this perspective. And I want you to try to imagine a world where no evil, what we call evil, would exist. So really no death, no disease, no heartbreak, no sicknesses at all, no medical conditions or anything like that exists, no hunger, no poverty. When you start to think about how would that world work, it starts unraveling itself. Let's just take death as one. If you had a perfect, why does God allow death? And I think we sort of conflate evil with some of these other things. Why does God allow this? Why does God allow that? Free will is sort of the go-to that a lot of people do, but I don't think they explain it fully. Free will, why does God allow free will? That in itself is the creation. If God had already these things that a lot of people think God has already predestined what we're going to do. Not really. He knows what we're going to do, but we have the decision and the free will and the power to make these decisions ourselves. Now, if we really weren't controlling anything or weren't able to do anything, that wouldn't be a creation. If every time somebody died, or let's say we just at some point stopped aging, there wouldn't be a need to reproduce. There wouldn't really be a need to expand or a need for families, because after a certain amount, it's like, hey, we have 10,000 people. Why do we need more? It really does start unraveling when you start thinking about, why does God allow death and disease and evil to begin with? Another thing coming off of that. Sorry about that. My daughter came into the room, but so talking about why does God allow evil, and I want to get over this hurdle with you because it's a hurdle a lot of people have, and I completely understand this hurdle. But I want you to think about a world without free will, a world without any sort of destruction or disease or anything like that. it's difficult to imagine how that would work. Everything would sort of be done for us. I'm not even sure if we would need to eat. I mean, if in order to avoid hunger, you wouldn't need to eat. I'm not even sure if we would need families, like I mentioned, or if we would even need to think, really. So really the creation sort of has to have some sort of free will, and we create the evil. So why does God allow evil? If God were to truly destroy evil completely, he would have to destroy us. Almost all of us, or really all of us, because everybody in some way, has some sort of proclivity to evil or greed or something. And that's the beauty of why God, and it starts to make sense when you think about why God sends his son down. And it was to heal us of even our physical medical issues that we might have. Being blind, he healed crippled people. What a great thing to have, right? And that's sort of answering that question. We might have to live with these things, but God has this ultimate solution. And we killed that guy. So we think about, somebody coming down to solve that problem. He does that, and then we kill him. It's just very interesting. I also would say that God gives us the solution, because you think about people that, kids that don't get to fully develop, or whatever other terrible, scenario that people are put in, cancer and all these difficult things. God does solve that problem and invites us to follow his son, Jesus Christ, and himself, and invites us into the kingdom of heaven, to live for eternity. So he's solving that issue. So we already have a solution to the problem. And now it's just, well, why does the problem exist? And it's just a part of the creation. We are the problem. And it's a tough thing to say, but I mean, God will kind of open up in Genesis. We'll read about it, but God will open up and say, like, I'm not even sure if this was a good creation. I think he's like, well, why did I create man? It seems to be a bad thing. And, you think about like going back into the snake, and I don't want to go too far down that road. And why did that exist? And maybe God ultimately, was that just something that needed to happen? Did God live with this creation and say, hey, there is no expansion, there's nothing happening, this is just a painting on a wall? I don't even know if that is a creation. Were we destined to sort of go live out on our own? I think so, and I think we'll talk more about that when we start the series. But I think God needed to send us out into the world and follow him without him just doing it for us. So why does God allow evil? It's a big hurdle a lot of people have. But I want you to sort of think about it from a different lens, and sort of understand that that is sort of part of the creation itself, and that we're not just robots that are just going to sit idly by and sort of have everything done for us. There really is no creation in that. But we'll talk about, evil, God destroying evil. He does this a lot, especially in Genesis. It's sort of funny. Atheists have a problem that God allows evil, but they also have a problem when he destroys evil, like what happens, in the flood with the Amalekites. I mean, there's several examples of God, taking the gloves off, and it's going to be something we get into, and it's actually sort of set up for us to understand in Abraham and Abraham's conversation with God. So it is going to be something that's going to be really cool to learn about in the beginning, because it's going to sort of set a standard as far as why does God, or how does God approach evil, and when does he completely destroy it? And ultimately, him sending his son down here to sacrifice himself is the ultimate defeat of evil, in the sense that we sort of think about it. A lot to talk about, but I have to do this introduction because it's going to kind of help you maybe sort of start this process and start the Bible. We're going to go through the entire Bible, every single chapter, virtually every verse. I mean, we're going to cover everything. So we kind of have to start off with some of these big questions, because if you're sort of hung up on that, it just might be difficult. Let's talk about, so we have, I'm going to turn my light on. Yeah, no light. Okay. So, all right, we've already decided, hey, we're creationists. We're buying into creationism. We dipped our toe in, so to speak. It's sort of like that scene in The Matrix where Neo, puts his finger in the mirror and it overtakes him. All it takes is just a little bit of a creationism, and now everything's possible, except the opposite. He actually comes out of the Matrix, but you get what I'm saying. So we've already established that everything is possible, and we don't really have to go prove anything to scientists. It's just not a requirement from the beginning. But now we need to pick a creator. So we still haven't done that. So why Christ? Why are we doing the Bible and not whatever other thing? For me, it's been the religion that exhibits the most truth, and allows for human flourishing, while still observing humanity and grace, the truths of Jesus Christ themselves. So I'm not even going to go quite into the proof that he existed, but let's just talk about the truth of what he said. He who is without sin, throwing the first stone. It sort of changed culturally how everything, used to be, I would say, like, dealt with. You would have just sort of this continual reaction between people. And, I did, something bad, and then somebody else comes in and does something bad, and you have all these different conquering, somebody conquers this one nation, or whatever it is. And that's sort of how the old world used to work. And you're like, well, it still works that way. Well, not really, because after World War II, America had this atomic bomb. And I think before Christ or something, if Christ didn't exist yet, we very well could have just, took over everything. But we didn't, because we did approach having that power with grace. And it's hard to do that if you don't have something grounded, if you don't have any morals. So he who is without sin, throwing the first stone, is a big one. Be reconciled with your enemy quickly, sort of along the same line. Turning the other cheek, which again creates peace among people who are maybe having issues with each other. It's now a way to end it, instead of having this continual vengeance. This what is that story with the pigs and the pig that starts, the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? You have the Hatfields and the McCoys. It's just an endless cycle of vengeance. I think somebody should have picked up their Bible. But anyways, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is another big one. We're not going to go into everything he said, guys. We just don't have time. This is just an introduction video. I'm just giving you into my reasoning into why Christianity and why not Islam or Buddhism or whatever it is. The kingdom of God being something that I can look forward to in living with him for eternity. That's a big benefit that you might not find in any other religion. The family structure is a huge one for me, guys. I mean, basically saying that, a man and wife shouldn't really ever be separated, and there should only be one man, or, one husband, one wife. That's different than other religions. You have some religions that believe in polygamy, and that's why I'm not a big fan of Mormonism. And that's why if we ever cover Mormonism on this channel, it's going to sort of be to discredit it. But that's a beautiful thing, and that's not something I think a lot of people give credit for. The 10 Commandments, which also found in Judaism, but those are, for me, set in stone, and they're different than the other commandments at that time for a reason. They are beautiful once you understand them, but they're going to promote things like not lying, not stealing. Again, some things you can find in other religions, but when you sort of weigh all these things with each other, this is how I came to Christianity. It is just the truths that Christ speaks into the world. Other things would be all the prophecies that were fulfilled by Christ. And if you ever go look at a chart, maybe we'll pull it up. Another thing about this channel is we are going to do a lot of visual aids, so I would recommend using the YouTube because I want to make this as something where you can use this to understand each chapter, and to do that we might need to look at maps or have a visual aid. So I recommend you watch this on YouTube. But the 300 different prophecies that are filled by Christ coming, I could point to Isaiah 53 and on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and having a prophecy of Christ before Christ is a big thing to have, and we do have that. It is a big sort of, for me, this maybe the smoking gun you could call it, but I already have all this evidence over here for the creationism, and now we're sort of just as icing on the cake as far as Christ, because there's a lot of evidence for Christ. You can sort of go down that rabbit hole, which would be, I would call it like the case for Christ rabbit hole, and proving Christ existed, which almost all scholars are going to totally agree that Christ existed. Whether he did the miracles, that's something that a lot of atheists will have an issue with. But these are all coming from sources at the time, all the different authors of the Bible, Paul's encounter with Christ. There's a lot of archaeological evidence for the Christian God. Pontius Pilate, there's evidence that he existed. There's evidence of the House of David that was found at a gate system in Dan in 1993. The Magdala Stone, the Shiloh Tabernacle, already mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Shroud of Turin, which is very interesting. It seems to be pretty much what looks like Christ and the blood of Christ, and people can't explain how they got this figure to be perfectly preserved into this. Go down those rabbit holes if you need to, but there's mentions of David outside of the Bible. There's secular sources of Christ coming from Tacitus, who was a Roman. There's a lot of evidence for the baptism of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ specifically. Then you have a very interesting one, which is Constantine's vision. I don't think enough people point out that happens 300 years after Christ, and he is a Roman emperor, and that's when Christianity is finally accepted in the Roman Empire as a okay religion, I guess you could say. Very interesting. Apostles, all the different apostles and their martyrdom, which, why would they have, and goes back to the case of Christ, but why would they have died for this if it didn't exist? It just doesn't make any sense. You have Paul, who was a scholar and a very smart person and who could write, but also you're going to say he was having these weird visions, and they were just visions, and he was hallucinating. It doesn't make any sense, especially when you think about all the people at that time that followed Christ and that wrote about Christ. All the people that lived with him, his disciples. So, I'll go through other little things too. And during our time, we'll do a whole podcast maybe on the archaeological evidence for Christ. We can do a whole podcast on atheism versus creationism. I kind of wanted to just give you an overview of sort of how you come to start the Bible, because if you don't answer those tough questions, I find it sometimes difficult. Although we will sort of go through that. The next episode, we'll kind of talk about how the Bible was collected. The way that this is going to work is you'll sort of get an assigned reading. So for this first Bible companion, we're going to look at Genesis chapters 1 through 5. So you just go read chapters 1 through 5, and then listen to the podcast, go watch whatever other YouTube videos or whatever other resources you have, books or whatever it might be that might help you explain it, study guides or study Bibles. And then I would welcome you to read it again. Once I started doing this, it really helped me understand the Bible a lot more. We do need to do this with somebody else. And that's why I'm here. I want to be your friend. I love you. If you're an atheist, I welcome you to come down this journey. I think it's going to be more difficult for you, but I still welcome you. If you're whoever else wants to learn about Christ, I want you to come on this faith journey with me. We'll do it together. I don't think anybody quite understands the Bible completely, and I think that's the point. I think you run into problems when you run into somebody or a church or something that says, yeah, we understand fully the Bible and listen to us. They very well could have a full understanding of most of everything, but we're all sort of doing this together. And I just want to be somebody that you do this with, because it's fun, and I want to make it fun and entertaining, and I'll sort of come at things from different perspectives. But I love you guys. I hope you had fun so far. We'll do Genesis chapters 1 through 5. Make sure you read that, and then I'll see you next week. Love you guys.